Hi there, folks. Well, we've reached the end of another season of of definitely somebody's favourite TV show, Outlander. Yes, that time-travelling adventure drama show has wound its 7th season to an eventual close after that absurdly long mid-season hiatus. And was it worth the wait? Are we hopeful for the future? And what exactly happened in the season finale? Well, strap in, folks, because I'm about to let you know. Episode 716, 100,000 Angels, actually starts out with a flashback to Jane and her fanny running through the meadows, and then meeting a lady, who's all blurry. And it turns out it's just a daydream memory, because in actual fact, Jane is being interviewed by some kind of newspaper man, and she's giving him all the sass, as well as proving yet again that she's not enumerate.
There are 52 cards in a deck. 26 red, 26 black.
I like science.
But also she's been kinda like, I'm proud as shit of my wee murder, and she's not above a few shameless cliches while she's at it.
My only regret is that he isn't alive.
No. Wait.
So I could do it again.
It's so shameful.
And despite the fact that she's all smirk and smarm, he ends up pointing out that her sister is almost certainly going to end up reading or hearing about what he writes down, so maybe she should put her own side across, Elsewhere, back in the church of Chop and Slop, Claire's on the mend, and Jamie's waffling in his distress about blood types and transfusions, and about how Claire once explained this to him, but his primitive old world mind of humours and bad spells can't quite get all of it figured out. Luckily, he doesn't have to though, because she wakes up, presumably because Stars must have just finalised her contract for Season 8. And since she's out of the woods, it's not long before the rest of the extras all come back, and then Ian swings by to tell Jamie the good news about William's rescue, and his wife tells him that Claire's pretty much fine, which is probably a surprise and a relief, seeing as he didn't actually know that she was shot in the first place. Most likely she's going to be up and about in a day or two, because sepsis and recovery time apparently doesn't exist in this world. And Jamie's also like, Hundo P, I have quit the army, and they can just like it or lump it. I'm quite sure it won't lead to a court-martial or anything at all, really. So he goes back to helping out Claire when she needs to pee and poo, which she ends up complaining about for some reason. Then she starts heavily implying that if she's dying, he should probably try and bonk her corpse, like an elephant would do.
What?
Before asking him to let them both just go home. Since she's already acting odd, it's probably not a great surprise that that night she ends up having a really weird dream where that old fucking French alchemist from Season 2 appears and to tell her that it's not her time to go, and then asks her forgiveness for something or other, and then she ends up hallucinating an eagle's bum for some reason. I mean, I don't know what drugs she's on, but I wish I could get hold of some of them. But that dreams ended up leaving her kind of feeling mournful, because it reminded her of when they lost the wee baby Faith back at the end of Season 2, which is kinda sad. And sometime round about then, Lord John rocks up as well to say hello, because apparently news travels that fast and nobody seems to mind this well-known and literal British spy just wandering right back into the middle of rebel territory. And Claire's happy to see him, and Jamie's a bit stiff and gruff, but the William rescue seems to have broached that rift a little bit. And thank God, because it looks like even Claire is bored sick of that storyline. And a mere scene change later, she's back on her feet and it's time for Denzel to turn up and have his moment, because apparently this week everybody gets a chance to make Claire's near-death experience a teaching moment for them, where she gets to lecture them.
Meanwhile,
back in Camp UK, Will tells his dad about the Jane problem, and he's like, I'll see what can be done, but yeesh. And Will's like 100% on Jane's side because Captain Bucksex had used her abominably. Abominably. Oh, jeez. Unfortunately, Jane already confessed, and she said that she stabbed him 26 times, which means someone somewhere must be lying. But anyway, John points out that maybe he should have just married her and played the wedding get out free card, but he didn't know about that, so unluckily, she's now been caught and she's confessed, and that means she's going to get hanged. So, might as well have a drink and just forget about it. But William's not all about that, so that night he rocks up to the church that everyone wants to hang out at and asks Jamie to help him. And Jamie's like, aye, why not? So they go on a wee adventure to rescue Jane, who by now is getting kind of drunk and humming an oddly familiar tune while waving out the window drunkenly at the Northern Lights, which itself is slightly weird and ominous. Anyway, Team Will Jam use a trick to quietly crack the window and sneak inside without anybody hearing, but unfortunately they then get surprised by another guard. But luckily, knocking him out nets him some keys. It's like a video game. But too late, because unfortunately, Jane took the quick way out and got herself dead from unaliving. So they end up laying her out and saying goodbye, and Jamie cuts Will a lock of her hair, but then actually says it's to give to wee Fanny. Okay. And then the wee lass is understandably quite emotional about all this, so they agree to adopt her back out to Fraser's Ridge. They also say that they're going to get Jane's body properly buried, which Jamie says he'll sort out. No problems or questions asked, just trust me, it's going to happen. But then it's time for father and son to talk about his mother, and Jamie does his best to avoid the slightly less savoury aspects of that business, which, 20 years on, it's understandable maybe that he's rather kind about the woman who blackmailed him into having sex and baby daddying. And there's a lot of words that he says that none of which spell rapist. But anyway, Jamie, apparently he blames himself now. Okay. And out in the potter's field, wee Fanny's getting really sad about not being able to find Jane as she was yeeted into an unmarked grave. So Claire gives her a gentle chat and Fanny starts describing the opening flashback scene and how they used to wave at the Aurora Borealis. Then Claire gives her Jane's stuff, including a locket with a drawing of Fanny's mum, who was called Faith. Wow, what a coinky-dink.
Meanwhile,
Roger and Buck are just heading out of Lallybroch when they notice a very contained bit of fog, and then out of the middle of it which runs Jemmy. And he's delighted, of course, and then quite confused because Brianna and Mandy come chasing out as well. And that's great, aside from the fact that they're all now in 1730 odd and they're going to need like 5 gems instead of the 2 that Roger and Buck would need. I mean, that's kind of a pickle. And inside Hotel Lallybroch, where Brian must be fucking furious by now from all the uninvited guests drinking his whiskey, Bree goes to chat to him, and he starts waxing lyrically all about his wife and how Brianna reminds him of her. It's very sweet. And Roger and Bree agree that they kinda need to get out of this time zone, but where are they gonna go? Which time zone? When? Oh, and Ian and his missus are back in bed, as usual, and they're thinking about moving back to Fraser's Ridge, which, on account of all their shameless newlywed rutting, has got her firmly up the duff, so they're off to start a family and get away from the war. And that's kinda lucky, because the next morning he wakes up and finds out that his precious wee doggo has actually died during the night. And, no joke, this is probably the saddest scene I've seen in the show in about 5 seasons. And despite them saying they're off to do it, we don't actually get to see a doggo funeral, but what we do get to see is everyone get ready to vamoose. But then Claire hears Fanny singing I Do Like to Be Beside the Seaside, which not only sets off some flashbacks, but also makes it clear that something is very, very wrong, because, unless you didn't know it, that song was written in like the 1920s.
How could you possibly know that song?
My mother taught it to me.
Which means...
I think our daughter lived.
Well, that's a twist to end the season on. For sure. So what did I think? Well, this episode was quite interesting because in terms of moment-to-moment stuff, there was quite a lot of scenes and quite a lot of things happening. But, kind of like I was a little worried about last week, it was something of a nothing burger in terms of actual ongoing plot. I mean, I'm not saying it's a bad episode, but I'm saying there was a lot of toing and froing, and the important beats, again, were kind of skipped over fast. But before I get into things that bugged me, I'd like to point out that I rag on Claire and Jamie a lot in this show, and I'd like to reiterate that I actually think Katrina and Sam do really good work, and especially hard work with some of the material they're given. And the problem is, I find a lot of the dialogue cheesy and overwritten, but they are acting it, and don't ever get the wrong impression from me about any of this. Everyone has actually been pretty good this season, maybe with the exception of Robert Rankin, who just seemed a bit half-hearted in some of his scenes. I mean, again, I kind of imagine that's probably because he shot this in his off days and weekends when he wasn't filming as the lead in the Rebus show, which I don't know if anyone else has watched. I saw a couple episodes. It's not my thing, but it wasn't actually too bad. Also, give this kid a BAFTA or an Emmy or something. She's like 10 years old and she is knocking it out of the park. She is really, really good. One scene I'd like to talk about is the Brianna and Brian's wife stuff, but also particularly the moment when Brianna looks at the painting. I was really surprised by this. I wonder if that painting of Ellen is actually a painting of the actor who will be playing her in the upcoming spin-off show. The actor they've cast in the role is called Harriet Slater, and to be honest, it kind of really does actually look like her, and it would also make sense, because if you noticed in this shot, it's quite obvious that Sophie Skelton has actually been green screened into this shot. She's not actually at that location, which possibly could mean that they hadn't either cast the role or they hadn't made this painting at the time when they shot Sophie Skelton's stuff for season 7. Which, all makes sense. Part of this is laying it on so that as a tease and a setup for that show, because apparently that show drops during the summer this year. Frankly, I've got to be honest, I can't remember diddly about Brian and Ellen other than she dies before he does and he dies before Claire goes back in time. To be honest, part of the issue with this is I haven't actually rewatched most of this show since the first season. I saw that a couple of times, and everything else I've probably only seen most episodes once, or twice at best. And in my head, I keep mixing up Brian with Ned Stark's dad. I mean, there's definitely one point where I caught myself thinking, oh, Brian, doesn't he get burned by the Mad King? But then, no, that was a completely different show, a completely different character. And look, yeah, as I said, I don't rewatch the show, I don't read the books, so some of these background details are going to slide for me. Now, there's not a huge amount of information about Blood on My Blood as yet, but it seems to be that it's about Brian and Ellen and their romance, and at the same time cross-cutting with Claire's mum and dad when they got together back in World War One. Sounds interesting, and yeah, it kind of thematically ties up with this week's episode quite a bit. But we've literally got the Quaker pregnancy scene side by side with Dead Rollo. And we've got Claire's potential death with all the Raimondo stuff, the callbacks to Faith. It's all connected. And, I like that, even though it is a little bit cheesy at times. I mean, what's going to come next? Is Jamie's secret evil twin brother Rico going to pop up during the season finale? I mean, we are kind of on the edge of that level of bad soap opera stuff with this. But yeah, as I said, Faith flashbacks, callbacks, weird stuff to do with Jane and Fanny and their mum. It's interesting. It's thematically interesting, at least. And a theme is important because it helps to glue together a whole load of disparate story parts and ideas sometimes. However, theme only gets you so far. As somebody famously once said, themes are for high school book reports. And despite there being a clear theme to this week, it was also, much like the rest of Season 7, kind of a wobbly mess of people coming and going for fairly little interest, concentrating on the wrong things at the wrong times, and skipping over the things that were interesting in favour of waffle and bits that people remember from the book. Now, I will say that the last 10 minutes of this finale were probably the most interesting part of it, mainly because, as we said, we got this whole hint of Jane potentially being a time traveller, or at least her mother Faith being a time traveller. It was an interesting, subtle wee hint for about 5 minutes till the show came along and went, no, we've got to underline this 100 times and explain it for any idiots sitting up the back of the class who maybe aren't paying attention. The reference to Faith earlier put you a little in mind of things. And if you remember the show, you'll remember that Claire was singing Be Beside the Seaside, and then you hear her sing something that sounds vaguely like that song. And I was like, oh, okay. But then the show gets to the end and it goes, no. When Fanny starts singing it, we've got to literally have a flashback of Claire doing that, just in case you didn't realise. Honestly, I just wish the showmakers would credit the audience with a small amount of intelligence, just a little bit. And I know that's kind of ironic considering I literally just said I didn't remember anything about Brian. But Brian was a character who was only ever mentioned. Faith's death was something that was an entire episode of the show, and a very important one, and has been brought up since. And yeah, look, the death of Faith was a right wee shame, and it's definitely a sad moment in the show, and I will accept that Claire being fever-brained and post-surgery might leap on a coincidence of a possible time traveller connection and the fact that they have the same name. But are we forgetting that Claire and Jamie literally buried Faith? When she was very dead, like she was pop her in a hole in the ground dead. The nuns handed the body over to Claire when it was probably still warm, and we're assuming that no matter what bizarre magic shit Raimondo the Fabulous might have magicked with a dead baby out somewhere, or worse, swapped out a live baby with another dead baby who's conveniently just dead and also incredibly ginger. I mean, all of that, it strikes me as either being incredibly ghoulish and in bad taste, or just really, really stupid. I mean, we're kind of straying into like the worst of the most recent Star Wars things here. You know, the Rey Palpatine problem. And remember in the recent Star Wars trilogy, there was that character Rey who didn't know her parents. And then in the next film, it was said that they were nobody. And then in the next film, they said, haha, joking, that was a lie. She's actually Emperor Palpatine's granddaughter because, I don't know, that's the most boring pedestrian thing we could come up with. And we like cheap shock to make the audience go, ooh. And I don't mind them doing something interesting with Jane and Fanny. But Faith? It's just weird. And what's more, Mr. Raymond? I mean, I'm happy they got the actor back. I like him. He's a good actor. He's always been interesting and stuff. But 5 seasons of never mentioning that character, and then suddenly the show goes, oh yeah, here we go. And I know the show likes to flirt with this idea of magic existing, other than the time travel, but it's been so sporadic over the seasons. Like, we had the magical bullshit poison detector amulet in season 2, and I was very not happy about that back then. But since then, we've had, a magical stone and a skull, and we've had the bit of mysterious blue light in a tunnel, and that's literally it. If we're leaning into the final season with more of that, fine, I suppose, but A, why leave it till this point in the story and in the series? And B, why not just not do it? I mean, there's really no need. And I will grant you this, the Aurora Borealis, which, even though it looked kind of fake, because the Aurora Borealis doesn't actually move like that. It only looks like that when you see pictures of it because people use time-lapse photography. I have seen it. It doesn't move. It's pretty still. And also, it's not usually a bluey colour, and I think that's on purpose. Normally, I mean, anytime I've ever seen it, it's been green or pinky red, but this was definitely blue. And that made me wonder, does that mean that's because it's supposed to be blue for a reason? Is it supposed to be the same magical blue like the bit in the tunnel underneath the dam? I mean, we saw Jane waving at it. Is that supposed to make us think that her soul got magicked away by magic sky people? I don't know, are we going down weird paths with this story? And if so, no, it's not what I'm here for, if you know what I mean. Other than that, can I also just say, the show spectacularly failed to make Jane act like anything other than a dislikable shite. The scene at the start made me kind of glad that she's getting her neck stretched, even though I actually expected her to escape. But now, with everything we know, and establishing that she's technically Jamie and Claire's granddaughter, so her bonking William, who's Jamie's son, that's kind of icky, and that sort of puts a whole new spin on this stuff. So, I mean, are you feeling okay, Diana Galbadone? Have you been watching a bit too much of Game of Thrones recently before writing, and you thought, I really need to do some of that? But enough about all that. Another wee thing. Why did Claire care if Jamie saw her pee? I mean, aside from it being a bit of a callback to that scene in that movie Babel, which is a really good movie and you should watch it. But yeah, it seems a bit strange because this is Claire who, remember back in season 1, happily pissed away in front of a whole bunch of women while they were walking wool. Do you remember? Yeah, well, Jamie's also been in and about Claire more than any other human being, possibly other than her gynecologist. And it seems a bit strange for her to be a bit funny about him being in the room while she went for a pee post-surgery. She seems more practical than that. It just comes across as a bit bizarre. And one problem I had this week was that half of this episode was Claire swanning about convalescing. Now, sure, she was injured, and Henry got over a similar wound in about an episode and a half off screen, so I'm kind of happy that they showed some progression of time there. But that didn't work this week because the William storyline made it clear that this is all supposed to take place over about a day and a half at most, if not all the same day. And yet she goes from literally surgery to being back on her feet again after a bowel resection, with no modern stitches, no aftercare, no antiseptic, no anaesthetics, other than a piece of cheese jammed into the wound. It feels a bit ridiculous to me. I've seen enough MASH to know that you don't get up and walk about a day and a half after having your bowels chopped up and sewn back together. Now, as well as that, Jamie quitting the army in the middle of the battle and nobody giving a toss, that doesn't make sense to me. Not only that, he's claiming that he's still owed favours from the British. I mean, mate, they literally sailed you home to Scotland for free with diplomatic immunity and freedom to roam about once you got there, despite the fact you were a known rebel on the opposite side during a war. I don't think anybody owes you anything, and the logic bending the story is doing to facilitate the main characters getting to do what the plot wants them to do is becoming completely ridiculous. Also, as I said during the recap, I get that Jamie doesn't want to upset Will and wants to speak nicely of his mum, but this just comes across as weird revisionist history. I mean, of her being fine and courageous rather than her being an obnoxious, stuck-up sex offender. I mean, sure, Jamie would never say that and he's trying to be nice to his son and trying to cheer him up because he's already sad that he's a bastard. But, I mean, the king of men is kind of turning into the father of lies in his old age. And I get from a storytelling point of view, you probably want Jamie, Claire, John and William to be on relatively good terms with each other for the story to continue, especially into a new season with a whole set of new arcs. But it did feel slightly flat and contrived. Also, the Ian story. I mean, what's happening there? All bloody season we've been debating the morality of killing. And then last week, he just ops Captain Hessian and then looks a bit sad. And this week, nah, don't worry about that because, oh, by the way, pregnancy and dead dog. We're back to the point of it feeling like a supercut of moments of the book, badly jammed together, and in doing so robbing themselves and also the surrounding scenes of a lot of the meaning and importance they could have. And I'm not saying anything that I haven't said a dozen times or more. So let's maybe just move on to where we stand and what's coming next. So where does that leave us now? Well, surprisingly, it actually leaves about half the cast in a fairly decent place. I mean, we've got Jamie and Claire and Ian and Rachel, with wee Fanny in tow, apparently all back off to Fraser's Ridge, which sort of makes sense, although considering how vaguely things were left, it seems a little bit bizarre. I mean, I presume they're going back to basically a bunch of empty land with a burnt out building, then nobody else has confiscated, what with Jamie being a known insurrectionist, and if not, I don't know why they never set to rebuilding it or something, but in any case, I'm sure we'll find out beginning of season 8, but they're back off to that set or somewhere similar. We've still got William and John having a water fight, although I can't imagine there being a huge amount to cover with them next season, other than them coming back and forward and saying hi. Roger and Bree, well, them and the kids being in the 1730s, I'm gonna guess they're gonna head back to the 1780s. I don't see them going back to the 1980s unless it's literally to pop home to grab a few odds and ends and to murder Rob Cameron and his pals. And Buck, I mean, I'm surprised Buck's even alive, so who knows what's gonna happen to him. But then again, I mean, he's got a bad heart, and Mandy does have that terrifying Raggedy Ann doll, so I've seen the Annabelle movies, he could be in for a horrible death one way or another. So I'm left in kind of a genuine quandary because the last thing established is this faith business. Now that would imply that the show is going to take a new turn and deal with that, but that's kind of a problem because Outlander is a show that tends to fill its boots with humdrum day-to-day drama and soap opera between moments of war and a little bit of timey-wimey fantasy. As I've said before, this is kind of Little House on the Prairie crossed with Dr. Quinn Medicine Woman with a little bit of time jumping. And with literally only one season to go, which will most likely be 10 or maybe 12 episodes long, and has to cover the plot that's built up over 2 full Diana Gabaldon-sized novels, one of which hasn't actually been published yet. So I've no idea how they plan to tie up these plots from 2,000 pages of story. I mean, even if they only do a few events from the book that's already out and then come up with their own ending, it's going to be a bit of a strange one. So we're now at the point where the show has to find a direction for the final season. There has to be some kind of overarching mystery because it is a situational drama. Now, as I've mentioned previously, the show used to predicate around the idea that the dramatic question was, would Claire get back to the future? Then in season 2, it's how did Claire get back to the future? Then in season 3, would Claire get back to the past? And would the pair of them ever meet up again? But from then on, the show has kind of been floundering around because there's been no central dramatic question. There's been occasional short dramatic questions that have covered like a small arc of a character or a small section of a series. But here we are again, at the literal end of the show, with one season to go, and there's no dramatic question. The only dramatic question seems to be now is there a strange mystery to do with Faith and Fanny and the blue light? But all of that literally came out of absolutely nowhere 5 minutes before the end of the episode. Every other character storyline is more or less tied up at this point. Everyone's pretty much at a flat baseline with nothing to do. I mean, you could just stop the show just before Fanny started singing that song, and that could have been the end of the show as far as it was concerned. Because everyone's pretty much in a good place with the exception of Roger and Bree, and all they've got to do is grab a couple of gems, hop through a stone circle, and hey presto. And that's a real problem for any story, because it means, much like the last few seasons, there's no central conflict or central driving storyline other than vague curiosity about what's going to happen next to these characters, which leads us to the point where it just becomes and then, and then, and then, and that's one of the worst ways that you can tell any story. And unfortunately, a lot of this comes back to the central problem that I've highlighted many times on this show. Claire is a character without a purpose in this show, and the show being so centralised around her is actually one of the big narrative problems with it. Now, it might work in a book, and it works if you look at this purely as a soap opera, but as a drama show, it needs to have something central for the audience to cling on to. The previous questions of, will she get back to the future? Those are obvious, universal ideas that pull the whole show together. Think about another TV show like Lost, for example. Will they ever get off the island? And then later, will they ever get back to the island? Think about shows like Breaking Bad. You've got the overhanging question of, will Walt live long enough to make the money to look after his family as he gets deeper and deeper into problems? And yes, shows can evolve and bring new dramatic questions, but Outlander is a show that shuts these dramatic questions down every other season, and then has led to the point where it's kind of just a dither. And I'm not saying enjoying watching these people doing things is bad, because it's not. We all watch shows about characters who we like, and we want to see them go through travails, have happy times, have sad times. But as a piece of entertainment, this just isn't working. And for the final season, they're going to have to land with an absolute punch that is going to have to bring everything together and give the entire Outlander story a satisfying conclusion one way or the other. And at present, the only thing I can think of that is a linchpin that could possibly tie this all together is the ghost of Jamie right at the beginning of the first episode. But there's nothing in the show so far that has ever pointed in any way to explaining that in any way, shape or form, and to throw in that in the final season in a way that's going to make sense, like the problem with the magic of the show simply hasn't been establishing that throughout its run properly, then to come up with something that's going to explain that, great. But I feel like it's going to be thrown in the last 5 minutes, much like the Faith and Fanny business and the magic here. What's it all about? It simply doesn't make sense. With that in mind, I've no idea how Season 8 can be anything other than a disappointment. I mean, remember all the hope we had for the last season of Game of Thrones? Well, something in my gut tells me we're looking at the same thing for the final season of Outlander. I mean, again, I hope I'm wrong, but I suppose we'll have to see. If you've had any thoughts about this, feel free to drop a comment down below, but yeah, that's where I stand with Outlander at the moment. So until next time, these have been my grumpy opinions.